There's this phrase bandied about a lot these days on YouTube by certain talk show hosts. Limiting beliefs. What is meant by a limiting belief? These are my thoughts from a non-PhD, non-MD, and non-college graduate perspective. Although I would say that I have sat in more electrical engineering classes and mathematics classes than you can shake a stick at, but I do not have degrees in these areas, nor any college degree. Now, for some time, psychiatry had used the word delusion. I have looked into that term a lot. Seems to me that who has a delusion and who doesn't is in the eye of the beholder, first of all, as to who is claiming someone else has it. Second, that this can always be used inappropriately by some in positions of power, too. To see someone else go down the rabbit hole, shall we say, and or for profit motive. In general, thus, who so-called has a delusion or not, or to what strength, is extraordinarily subjective. Now, on the internet a few years ago, I looked up the term insane, and one article or two was saying everybody is insane, society is insane. You might argue thus that we all have at least one delusion if you're going to call what some say a delusion to be a denial, and thus that we all have a denial of choice, just as the phrase is bandied about that we all have a drug of choice or some kind of addiction of choice. Of course, choice in my mind being a fallacious term. Now others, such as Chris Do, who has the channel The Futur, F-U-T-U-R, out of, is it Santa Monica, California, with a considerable audience these days, and financial acumen. He talks of the term delusions as lies we tell ourselves. I kind of prefer not using the word lie ever, very toxic term, but I prefer to use the term denial. And thus a limiting term in a sense is a denial. And another thought that impinged upon me a month or two ago is if we say somebody is naive, maybe what we're talking about is that that person has a limiting belief, a denial, if you will, as to some facet of reality that many people perhaps don't have a block on, a denial of. But in many other ways, that person might not have a denial about something else that many people do have a denial on. So if we're called naive, I think we need to take a look at who is saying it and in what way that person might have their own area of naiveness as per denial that they have, that who they're accusing someone else of doesn't have. If you get my drift, that's a little convoluted. Now, someone from the 1920s, Shin, I'm not sure of the spelling, had come out with the idea of a log jam. Like she talked of how sawmills used to, maybe still do, float logs down a river in certain places to get them to the sawmill. If one log blocked everything up, the flow, someone had to get out there and unjam things with that blocking log or two, and then things could flow again. I would say these log jams in the mind would be our denials, that almost everybody on the planet has at least one denial, hence arguably otherwise termed limiting belief. Now, what isn't said very often at all is, in my opinion these days, that these limiting beliefs are not necessarily something that we come up with totally on our own as per wishful thinking, and then implementing in a rigid basis as a denial, but something we may have a proclivity toward, like escape by use of drugs, but if it is marketed to us in heavily, then we're going to use it all the more, aren't we? And thus, a limiting belief, in a way, something that we need to ask, is this a limiting belief, or is it a product marketed to us so heavily that we can hardly escape it? In other words, is it a limiting belief? If you step outside your door and every 5 feet someone is selling alcohol as a great way of life to cope with problems, or every 5 feet there's a Maserati car dealership or exotic car dealership in general, or something a little less scaled even. If you're constantly marketed a denial, if you're constantly marketed an escape as per some concept in your mind, perhaps that is a big part of what we call a limiting belief, and why some people say you need to get out of the rat race and think for yourself in a calmer, slower manner. That alone then being an escape from the marketing of limiting beliefs or denials. Otherwise, euphemistically or more called propaganda, some would say, but I have chucked that word too out of my vocabulary. I love, by the way, Chris Do again saying that he likes to deneuter certain words. And others say that you probably should never use certain words. They're quite toxic in general, as per the impact upon others' psyche, their self-esteem, reputation, or possible consequences they might face if proven in a court of law as per that word used. So I think the upshot is that the word limiting belief is bandied about, but in my mind, what we could clarify this to mean is a limiting cognitive premise in our minds that is a denial. It's very fundamental. There are probably only in my mind about 5 different denials, roughly, but we don't like to speak of them. There is, for instance, I will say, Ernest Becker, back in around 1960, having won the Pulitzer Prize for his book, The Denial of Death. And this was picked up later in more academic fashion, too, by Sheldon Solomon in Callum in Canada, and some others. And to that extent, you could say a person is out of touch with reality, but a part of reality, not all of reality. Or you could call it strong wishful thinking that is rather chronic in a certain area, but not others. Others would say it's a lacuna, a blind spot. And we all probably have one or more blind spots. Why don't we call them limiting beliefs or denials of choice? Only it's not really a choice. If you look at the chain of events that preceded where a person is at right now. So you might say then, well, if that's all it is that holds us so back, limiting beliefs, why do they even exist? I would say because there's a lot of profit to be made, or a lot of emotional benefit in other ways by marketing limiting beliefs or denials. And life throughout history has been oftentimes largely a marketing of ways of escape, ways often involving escape using a denial. Hence, in the 1930s Depression era, many people wanted to go to the movies to escape. Maybe in the movies we escape to a different reality in terms of denying something, at least temporarily, whether it was dying, for instance, by poverty, in the short term especially. Those are my thoughts then on the topic of what we call limiting beliefs, and why it seems like a trivial term, and if there were such a thing as a limiting belief, why can't we just overcome it by pointing out what that belief is? Maybe it's because it is so heavily marketed for profit or other motive, often power, that it isn't talked of very often. It's the 10-ton elephant in the room. I would say, from a spiritual perspective, thus, that many things put in certain channels in the media or Hollywood, sometimes good, but often not so enlightening, are limiting beliefs or denials of reality that feel good in the short term, but do not help us or society or the world in the long term. And you could call them limiting beliefs that are marketed for profit or power. Maybe profit being part of power in general.